Hi, good morning. Good to see everybody here this morning. Today we're going to be in Psalm 84. Psalm 84, if you want to turn there, I think it'll be helpful to follow along. If you don't have a Bible with you, there should be one in close proximity to you, either under your chair or the chair before you. We are in Psalm 84, and this psalm is a psalm that beautifully speaks of a longing for the dwelling places of God. The psalmist here truly has a heart for the dwelling places of God. And at the time that this psalm was penned, the dwelling places of God was either the sanctuary, if you take King David as the writer of this psalm, or the temple, most likely Solomon's temple, if you take it as being penned by the sons of Korah. The title could be translated either way, either of the sons of Korah or to the sons of Korah. But nonetheless, it's just a person who longs for God's dwelling place, to be where God was. And back then, God's manifested presence was in the sanctuary, it was in the temple, and this psalmist is really expressing a desire to be where God was dwelling. And you see that in both the beginning of the psalm and the last part of the psalm. Verses 1 through 4 expresses a longing for the courts of the Lord, but also 8 through 12. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at those two sections first, and then we're going to get to the heart of the psalm in verses, or what I believe is the heart of the psalm in verses 5 through 7. But first, let's look at this desire for the dwelling places of God. It starts off in verse 1, "How lovely are your dwelling places, O Yahweh of hosts." How lovely are your dwelling places. That's a traditional translation of it. More literally, it would be translated, "How beloved are your dwelling places?" In other words, yes, they are lovely, but it's not so much that they look lovely, but more that they are loved by the people who go there and find themselves in those dwelling places. It's in all likelihood plural because it's talking about not just one section of the dwelling place of God, the Holy of Holies, but also the holy place, and then also the outer court. If it's during the temple period, there were several courts that surrounded the temple. And so all of that would be considered the dwelling places of God in connection to the temple. And then in verse 2 he says, "My soul has longed and even fainted for the courts of Yahweh." This individual or group of people evidently no longer had access to the temple, or at least their ability to access the temple had somehow been thwarted in some way, inhibited in some way. Some would say if this is David the psalmist, it might be when Absalom, his son, rebelled against him, and they were driven out of Jerusalem, and they weren't able to go back to the tabernacle for a while because Absalom had kind of taken over things there. If it's the sons of Korah, this might be during the time of either Sennacherib, who was the king of Assyria, who kind of inhibited the temple worship that was going on, or ultimately maybe even the Babylonian invasion where the Jews were thrust out of Jerusalem, the temple was destroyed, and no longer was in existence, at least for the time being. But nonetheless, it seems to be an individual who really is thinking about and reflecting on the tabernacle, the temple of God, and he says, my soul longs and even faints for the courts of Yahweh. You ever desired something so more you just long for it? Like you couldn't get it out of your mind. It was almost the feeling of wanting to just faint. You just beside yourself, wanting to get there. That's how he felt when it came to the tabernacle. He says, continuing in verse 2, "My heart and my flesh sing for joy to the living God." There at the tabernacle, at the temple, his heart and his flesh would rejoice before God. It could also be talking about, in just reflecting on the tabernacle, on the temple of the living God, his flesh and his heart would sing for joy. But the idea here is just that his inner being, which is shown by the heart, and then even his outer self, that is the flesh, the whole totality of who he was, had joy in connection to the dwelling places of God. And then in verse 3 he says, "Even the bird has found a home, and the swallow a nest for herself, where she sets her young. At your altars, O Yahweh of hosts, my King and my God." Even the birds, the small birds, had found their way into the dwelling place of God, and had constructed a little nest there, had found peace and security there in the tabernacle. And the psalmist is like, even the birds find a dwelling place there. Even the birds see it as a place of peace and security. And he says that kind of represents my desire also to be there with them. And so he's almost a little bit jealous of these birds, it seems like, that he wished he could make his nest there and that he could lay his young, perhaps, in the dwelling places of God, or at least near the dwelling places of God. In verse 4 he says, "How blessed are those who dwell in your house. They are ever praising you." Which may be related more to the temple. If you're thinking of the temple, there were people who they had different watches over the temple, and they would stay in the temple area for their shift of watching over the temple and stuff. And he may be talking about those who actually had their living connected to the temple, these priests, these Levites that would dwell there. He says they're ever praising you. What a wonderful thing. The birds are there finding peace and security. The people are there finding praise and joy there. And that made his heart long all the more to be in the dwelling places of God. So that's the first section where he talks about the longing for the dwelling place of God. But then, as mentioned, the latter part is verses 8 through 12. And it starts out, "O Yahweh, God of hosts, hear my prayer. Give ear, O God of Jacob. See our shield, O God, and look upon the face of your anointed." All right, so two ways of designating God there as God of hosts, but then also God of Jacob. God of hosts would show that God is sovereign over everything. He's the God of hosts. He's sovereign over all creation. All creatures bow down before him. Even the angels, the cherubim, the seraphim, the living creatures, everything bows down to him. He is Lord of hosts. He's Lord of all living things. But he's also a covenantal God in that he's the God of Jacob. And so him being designated as the God of Jacob, who was the forefather of Israel, whom he made a covenant with, shows that he's not just the God over all creation, but he's our own special God, the one who's in a covenant relationship with us. But it says, "See our shield, O God, and look upon the face of your anointed." And again, if this is penned by David, he might be speaking about himself. David was the king. He was the anointed king before God. And he might be seeking the Lord to then look upon him and to bless him as the anointed one, as the king of Israel. If it's not David, then they're just expressing or wanting that blessing to be upon whoever was the anointed king at that particular time, who was seen as their shield, and then, of course, also as their king, the anointed king. But he goes on in verse 10, he says, "For better is a day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere." He said, "I prefer to spend just one day in your courts than 1,000 places elsewhere." This place was more precious to the psalmist than any other place on the earth. To put it in our day and age, it was better than going to Disney World or Disneyland, better than going to the Bahamas, better going to Paris, the most sought after places on the earth, pale in comparison to the psalmist when it came to the courts of the Lord. It was the most precious place on earth for this individual. Not so much because it was necessarily the best place to be. It wasn't like he was seeking a place that would be fun or scenic or anything like that. It was because the presence of God was there. Because the presence of God was there, he preferred to be where God's presence was than 1,000 other places. He says, "I would choose to stand," or 1,000 days in other places. "I would choose to stand at the threshold of the house of my God, than dwell in the tents of wickedness." He said, "I prefer to be at the threshold. I prefer to be standing at the door, out in the weather, in the summer, in the heat of summer, in the cold of winter, with the rain pouring down on me maybe, no protection, no comfort, no pleasure from a fleshly standpoint. I prefer to be at that threshold, standing before the house of God, and to be in a comfortable tent, protected from the weather, in the comforts of the tent." Why was that? Well, because God was so good. In verse 11, "For Yahweh God is the sun and shield. Yahweh gives grace and glory. No good thing does he withhold from those who walk blamelessly. O Yahweh of hosts, how blessed is the man who trusts in you." Why would he not want to dwell in the tents of the wicked? Because the wicked are so bad. I mean, you're in the tents of the wicked. Yeah, you're in a comfortable bed, perhaps. Maybe you're You're in there where there's heat, and you're saved from the elements outside. But boy, if you're in the tents of the wicked, you better watch your back. You better be have your head on a swivel, because if you cast your lot with the wicked, they might accept you for a time, but eventually they're going to turn back on you in all likelihood. Because what are they after? They're after what they can gain, what they can get out of situations and out of people. And eventually that's going to fall back and haunt you and bite you. So you don't want to dwell with the wicked. You want to dwell even in just the threshold of God, because God's not like the wicked. He's a sun and a shield. In other words, he brings light and protection. He gives grace and glory. That is, he gives grace in the sense that he gives his help. He assists people, but also he imparts glory to people as they are connected to him. And then it goes on to say, no good thing does he withhold from those who walk blamelessly. So contrasted with the wicked, which is all about gimme, 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 take, God is all about blessing and giving and bestowing wonderful blessings on those who walk before him. That's why he would prefer to be at the threshold of the house of God than in the tents of the wicked. And then he says, oh, Yahweh of hosts, how blessed is the man who trusts in you. So again, you can see he desired the dwelling places of God, not necessarily because it was a fancy place. If it was the sanctuary, it was just a tent at that particular point. Solomon's temple, yes, was a glorious temple and was a beautiful thing. But still, if you really close read this psalm, you find that what he really seems to be desiring is not so much brick and mortar, not so much just tents and boards, but the living God. That's what made this dwelling place so desirable to him. So now that we look at those two bookends and we've got it pretty well established, okay, the psalmist or the psalmists really are longing for the dwelling places of God. Now let's look at the heart of the psalm and see the significance there. And it seems to be directed towards those who are making the ascent to Jerusalem. Jerusalem and Mount Zion are kind of used interchangeably. Jerusalem was up on a high place next to Mount Zion. It was also in Jerusalem that the temple, the sanctuary that we've been talking about, dwelt. And 3 times a year, the people would make a pilgrimage to the temple. And so because it's on a mountain, they're ascending up the mountain. They're ascending up in elevation to Jerusalem to keep the feast. Okay, that's kind of the context here. And it's believed that perhaps this psalm was something that was recited on the Sabbath days when people would gather for worship. And it could have even been, at least if not sung, while they were ascending to Jerusalem at the feast. It had to have at least been in their hearts and in their minds as they're going up to Jerusalem. So bear that in mind as we look at verses 5 through 7, where he says, how blessed is the man whose strength is in you and whose heart are the highways to Zion. Blessed is the man whose strength is in you. The journey was not going to be easy. It wasn't always easy, and we'll find that here in a moment in verse 6. But they found their strength in the Lord. The Lord was the one who was supplying them with the strength to ascend to Jerusalem to be there. And he was supplying that strength to those in whose heart are the highways to Zion. There was several highways that led to Jerusalem that made the ascent up to Jerusalem. But these individuals who desire the temple above everything else, who desire to be in the presence of God, to offer sacrifices to God, offerings to God, worship to God, these individuals had a heart for the highways to Zion. Their hearts were filled with the highways of Zion in the sense that that's what they were pursuing, that's what they were chasing after, that's where they longed to be. And so in their heart was the highways to Zion. And then he says, passing through the valley of Baca, they make it a spring. The early rain also wraps it up with blessings. Now this is a unique word, Baca. I believe it's only used, that is the Hebrew word for Baca. I think it's only used in the book of Proverbs one time. So this is a very rare word, a very difficult word to translate and to find the meaning of. But it's believed to be connected to a tree that would grow in arid places. And so the idea of being in the valley of Baca would be like going through a dry and arid place where these trees were growing. Also, if you look at the root of the word, it also has the idea of weeping. So some would say that perhaps what the psalmist is talking about, going through the valley of weeping, of tears, of difficulty. And either way you go, whether they're traveling through this dry place or they're going through a time of weeping and sorrow on their way to Jerusalem, it's a difficult journey. And in all likelihood, it is tied to being arid, because there's a contrast here made in a very poetic way by the psalmist, where he says the valley of Baca, they make it a spring. And the early rain also wraps it with blessings. And so it's a dry place, but at the same time, in this dry and arid place, there's water springing up. The spring comes from what? From the ground. And then, of course, the rain descends from above. So it's a dry and arid place. But for these who have their highways, or their hearts filled with the highways to Zion, even though they're going through those dry places, they find a spring springing up from the ground, and then also the blessings of rain from above. In other words, to them, because their heart are so intent in going to Zion, because they're so focused on getting there, that even when they're going through dry places, it's like going through a pool of water. It's like going through a refreshing shower in the spring. Probably more in the autumn, because that word for rain is more tied to the autumn rain. But still, they are traveling with this idea in their minds that they want to go to Zion, and therefore even dry places seem like very fruitful places to them. In verse 7, they go from strength to strength. Each one of them appears before God in Zion. So they go from strength to strength. In other words, they go from one level of strength to the next level of strength. As they're traveling along, as they're trusting in Yahweh, as they're trusting in God, and they find strength for this leg of the journey, guess what? Then they're stronger and more capable to take the next leg of the journey and to become even stronger. And from strength to strength, along this journey, eventually they make it to Zion. It says, each one of them appears before God in Zion. In other words, they're going to make it, because they're going from strength to strength. They're blessed because God gives them the strength to make it. They have a desire to make it. And even in the driest places, they're going to find refreshing water, at least in their soul and in their heart. So now that we have an idea of the initial meaning of the psalm and what the psalmist is talking about historically, in the historical context of when it was written, at least as best as we can tell, now we can look at it from a spiritual standpoint, because this psalm is not just beneficial for learning about how ancient people back, thousands of years ago wanted to go to a physical temple and desired to be there because that was the manifested presence of God. There's also a benefit for us even today. Now, things have changed since this psalm was written in relation to God and in relation to the temple. Now, if this is talking about the sanctuary that David worshipped at, the tent that traveled through the wilderness with the children of Israel and then was later erected by David there in Jerusalem, it was replaced. It was replaced by Solomon's temple, which was a actual building, a more firm place for them to worship God. But even that temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. The Babylonians came in because the people had just rebelled against God for 400 plus years. They just kept rebelling, and God sent the Babylonians to come and to destroy the temple. But then after 70 years, they were allowed back into the land by the edict of King Cyrus, and they go back to the land, they rebuild the temple. And that temple is usually called the Second Temple or Herod's Temple. And it lasted all the way to the time of Jesus. Whenever you read about Jesus walking at the temple or teaching at the temple, it's that second temple that's being spoken about. But even that temple was destroyed in AD 70. So after Jesus died, he was risen again, the gospel was spread. Some 40 years after Jesus had died and was resurrected, the temple that was in Jerusalem was destroyed, and it's never been rebuilt again. For 2,000 years now, there has been no temple. No temple as they had it back in the Old Testament. And there's good reason for that, because God, through Jesus Christ, has now brought about something better than the earthly sanctuary. As wonderful as it was, and the psalmist really gives us a beautiful picture of how wonderful it would have been to be in that earthly tabernacle, that earthly temple. how much better do we have now that we have Jesus Christ who ministers not in an earthly tabernacle, but in a heavenly one? In Hebrews chapter 8, in the first few verses there, it says, now the main point in what is being said is this, that we have such a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister of the holy places, and in the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched, not man. So here he's talking about a true tabernacle. They had a tabernacle that Moses pitched in the tent. They had a temple that Solomon constructed in Jerusalem. But here he's talking about a dwelling place, a tabernacle that the Lord pitched. He goes on in verse 3, for every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices, so it is necessary that this high priest also has something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there is to offer the gifts according to the shadow of the heavenly things. Just as Moses had warned by God when he was about to erect the temple for see, he says, that you make all things according to the pattern which was shown you on the mountain. But now he has obtained a more excellent ministry, by as much as he is also the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted upon better promises. So, in the midst of all that, what you get is that the tabernacle that Moses erected in the wilderness, you could even stretch that out to Solomon's temple, even stretch it out to the second temple or Herod's temple. Those were all just copies and shadows of something else. It's kind of like, excuse me, I'm going to take this jacket off. It's kind of like if you ever watch TV or something, or you watch a movie or a TV show, and they're going to build a shopping mall or something, and they have in this office this big table, and what they have is like this model of what the mall is going to look like, and it's to scale. I mean, you can look at it, you can see, you know, this is going to be the entrance of the mall, and this is where this store is going to be, and that store. But it's just a small model. But it's not the mall itself. It's just something for you to kind of be able to visualize what it's going to look like and how it's going to be structured. And that's kind of what the picture that we get by the Hebrew writer here in Hebrews chapter 8, that the tabernacle, the temple, were just kind of like a little model. It's kind of like a little model that would help people to understand some heavenly truths, understand some things that were going to be fulfilled later on in Christ. But it wasn't the true reality. It wasn't the true dwelling place of God. It was merely a copy and a shadow. And so the point that the Hebrew writer is making is, now that Christ has come, we no longer serve for an earthly sanctuary, but for a heavenly one. This idea is continued in Hebrews chapter 9, starting in verse 1, where the Hebrew writer goes on to say, now even the first covenant had requirements of divine worship and the earthly sanctuary. Notice he says the earthly sanctuary. Same sanctuary that's being talked about in Psalm 84. For there was a tabernacle prepared. And then he goes on to describe it, the first part in which was the lampstand and the table and the sacred bread that was in the holy place, which is called the holy place. Verse 3, and behind the second veil there was a tabernacle which is called the Holy of Holies, having a golden altar of incense and the ark of the covenant covered on all sides with gold, in which was a golden jar holding the manna, and Aaron's rod which budded, and the tablets of the covenant. And above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of those things we cannot now speak in detail. You know, you're reading everything, and these are wonderful things. You know, the rod that budded miraculously there in the wilderness, Aaron's rod that budded. You have this golden jar with the manna that they ate of in the wilderness. You have the cherubim of glory that was made of solid gold on top of the mercy seat. It had to have been a beautiful place to walk into. Everything was coated in gold. It was a beautiful place. But look what he says, skipping down to verse 11 of Hebrews 9. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things to come, he entered through the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this creation. And then he goes on to talk about the better sacrifices that he offered in connection to this heavenly tabernacle. And why do I say all this? Well, it's because when we're looking at Psalm 84, and we're thinking about the earthly sanctuary, can we not say with the psalmist, and even more so, intensify what we're saying when we agree with him to say, you know what? How lovely are the dwelling places of God. How wonderful must be the dwelling place that we long after, that is the heavenly tabernacle that is above. A tabernacle in which the glory of God doesn't just appear once a year to a person who comes, and has to offer up sacrifices and has to cleanse himself and go into the holy place and light the lamp and put out the showbread and offer up the incense and then only enter into that holy place, the Holy of Holies, once a year to see the glory of God between the cherubim. We have a heavenly tabernacle that we are looking forward to, in which the glory of God will be so powerful and so wonderful and so all-consuming that we'll just bask in the glory of God forever. No more sickness, no more crying, no more tears, no more sickness, death, all of that done away with. That's what that's what we're desiring. Isn't that better than just a physical temple where the swallow makes a nest and finds protection and peace? A place where maybe people lived and were praising God. Definitely praise is going on up there, but it's even intensified and even more glorified because they're in the actual presence and awe of God at all times. And so that's what we are desiring. That's what we're seeking for. That's what we're longing for. We're looking for that heavenly home, that heavenly tabernacle, that heavenly sanctuary that is in heaven. And so all the while we're walking on this earth, as we're living before God, as we're striving through the difficulties and trials of this life, that's where we're headed. That's the ascent that we're making every day. Every day is a step further on the ascent. So now, keep that in your mind and keep that in the forefront of your mind as then we go back to the heart of this psalm and look at it in more detail. In verse 5 of Psalm 84, where he says, "How blessed is the man whose strength is in you, and whose heart are the highways to Zion." How blessed is the man whose strength is in you. One of the wonderful things about this journey that we're on as we're ascending to the heavenly tabernacles above, to the dwelling place of God in its full reality, is because it's his strength that we go on. I am so glad I don't have to make this ascent on my strength, in my own strength. Poor Joey would tumble and fall and just go right back down the descent down to the bottom of the mountain and lose all traction and never make it another step. How blessed is the man whose strength is in you and not in himself. We can have confidence that we'll make it to that heavenly Jerusalem, not because we're so crafty and we're so smart and we're so intelligent, we can figure it all out, and that we have all the techniques and willpower that we need to make it there. We are blessed because our strength is not found in ourselves. Our strength is found in the Lord. And he's the one that supplies us the strength to make the journey. That ascent is a steep ascent, but it's a blessed ascent because we have our Father's hand pulling us up all the way, grabbing our hand and saying, come on, come along. I'll give you my strength. I'll supply it to you as you move along. And he says that this strength is for those whose heart are the highways to Zion. This is for the people who have a longing for Zion, the heavenly Jerusalem, the sanctuary that is above, the one that this one was just a copy and a shadow of, the glorious temple above. Those who have a heart for that, in other words, that's what they're pursuing, that's what their life is about, they're the ones that receive this strength and this help that God supplies. Not distracted by the world, not distracted by creaturely comforts and just trying to get a quick fix for today to try to, somehow get joy and peace and all the things from this world, but constantly and consistently fixing our eyes on things above. In Colossians chapter 3, we have an encouragement by the Apostle Paul and an instruction from the Apostle Paul to have a heart in which is the highways to Zion. This is what he says starting in verse 1 of Colossians 3. "Therefore, if you have been raised up with Christ, keep seeking the things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on the things that are on earth. For you died, and your life has been hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, is manifested, then you also will be manifested with him in glory." Isn't that wonderful? But that's where we should be setting our minds up to. That's where our hearts should be. We should have our eyes fixed on the heavenly Jerusalem that is above, making that ascent, pursuing that, making that what our lives are all about. Too often, and I'm speaking from personal experience, and maybe you can relate too, but oftentimes what are we doing? We're looking around, we're meandering. We're like cows just kind of meandering through the pasture, just looking for a next bite to eat, or like sheep that kind of just stray and just go here and there. We need to have our eyes fixed. Set your mind on things above, not the things of the earth. There's so many distractions in the world today. So many things that just are starving for our attention. And, it's like you're trying to stay focused, and then this is jumping at you, and that's jumping at you, and you have all these distractions. Paul would say, stop being so concerned about earthly things. Lift up your eyes. Lift up your consciousness to heavenly things. Set your mind on things above. Remember, you are on a journey. You are on a path. You are on an ascent. And you're only going to be successful if you have a heart which has the highways of Zion in it. It's all about having the heart that the people of faith had even in the Old Testament. In Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 13, we have a description of what this would look like practically in a person's life. Okay? Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 13. And he had been given a list of people who had walked by faith. That's why he says all these at the beginning. But Hebrews 11:13, he says, all these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been remembering that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they aspire to a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he prepared a city for them. So he's talking about those Old Testament saints who, they had the promises of Jesus Christ, of the Messiah. They had the promises that God was going to do this and forgive their sins and enact a new covenant and all these different things. But they were still seeking something better. They were chasing after the promises of God. And we, like them, as we are living on this earth, are the same way. We see our lives, or we see ourselves as strangers and exiles, seeking a better country, a heavenly country. Have you ever gone camping before? And whenever you go camping, what do? Well, it depends on what type of person you are. But in all likelihood, when you go camping, you go with the understanding that this is not my home. Okay? As a matter of fact, I'm planning on going camping in a few weeks with a friend of mine. And when we go camping, we're going to be in tents. But I'm not going to go there and then, erect a mailbox and kind of, plant myself there and say, okay, boy, I'm just going to sit back and relax and I'm going to make everything as comfortable as possible. I'm going there with the understanding that this campsite that I'm going to be staying at is just a temporary thing. I don't know how cold it's going to be. I haven't checked the weather or whether it's going to be rainy. Whatever's going on, even if it's miserable, all the time I'm miserable being there, I'm going to be knowing that I have a home somewhere else. That's where I ultimately live, and that's my home place. But too often, we as believers do that. This world is just a campsite for us to do God's work, to be committed to Him, to keep our heart full of the highways to Zion, to be focused. But too often, we make this campsite like it's our home. Like, okay, this is it. This is where I'm going to plant myself. And all we see around us is what? Death, decay, sorrow, sickness, heartbreak. It's not the best place to plant your feet. It's not the best place to make your home. What we want to do is say, you know what? This earthly tent, this body that I live in is just a temporary dwelling. And I have a heavenly home that I'm seeking after. I've got my eyes lifted above all these things. I'm not focused on the earth. I'm looking for that heavenly country to come. Knowing that that's where I'm going to plant all my ambition. That's where I'm going to put all my heart. That's where I'm going to put all my desire, because that's the one that will last. That's the one that will go for eternity. That's a place where there is no bad weather, where there's no cold temperatures, where there's no sickness or dying or crying or any of those things. That's where I want my heart to be. That's where I want my direction to be. And my heart is going to be filled with the highways to Zion. And so the psalmist would say these are blessed people. They're walking in the strength of God. Their hearts are filled with the highways to Zion. In other words, they have a desire to be there and to go there. But look at verse 6, going back to Psalm 84. Does it mean that it's always going to be rose petals and daisies as you're going through it? Is it that God's going to roll out now, oh, I have a desire to go to Zion, so now he's going to roll out the red carpet and everything's going to be easy? No. But we have something better than just an easy path. In verse 6 he says, passing through the valley of Baca, they make it a spring. The early rain also wraps it up with blessings. The circumstance that they're in doesn't really affect them, does it? Their circumstance, the situation they're in, is a dry and arid place. Right? That's what they're traveling through. But their circumstances doesn't affect them. Why? Because they have a spring that comes up that's not of this earth, and they have rain coming down that's not of this earth as well. A blessing that helped them through, because they're focused on where they're going, not where they're at. And this is true for the Christian. For the believer in Jesus Christ, those who have their eyes fixed on heaven, yes, we're going to go through some hard times. I'm not going to lie to you. There's going to be times that you're following the Lord, you're making the ascent to that beautiful heavenly Jerusalem, and you're going to find yourself in the valley of Baca. You're going to find yourself in dry places. You're going to find yourself where every step is difficult, as maybe people might make fun of you or slander you, or you might be ostracized by people. Maybe your family doesn't understand this journey that you've launched out on. It's not going to be easy all the time, but guess what? You're going to have a spring that springs up from the ground or from the heart, and then you're also going to have the heavenly blessings falling down from above, so that you will be fully saturated with the blessings of God as you're making the journey, and therefore not so affected by the circumstances, however bleak they might be. In John chapter 7 and verse 38, Jesus stood at the temple and he said, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink, and out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. He said, if you're spiritually thirsty, if you're dry from within, you realize that this religiosity that you've been seeing through the Jewish religion and the leaders and stuff, you want the real good stuff? Come to me, and out of your heart will flow rivers of living water. And John goes on to comment on that. As the Apostle John, he says that he spoke of the Holy Spirit that would come. God will impart to you the Holy Spirit that will then become within you a fount of living water. But we even have not only just a fount coming up from within, through God's presence dwelling within us, but we also have the heavenly blessings coming upon us. In 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 14, Peter says, if anyone slanders you for being a Christian, guess what? You're blessed. Why? Because the Spirit of glory rests on you. When you go through hardships of being a Christian, that's a good place to be. Why? Because that's when you get to experience the presence of God like never before. God has a special comfort, consolation, and peace that he'll supply you when you hit those hard times. When you go through the valley of Baca, you're going to have that fount of living water springing up from within. You're going to have the heavenly grace pouring down upon you from above. And guess what? You can walk anywhere if you have the supply of heaven in your life as you're going through this sometimes arduous and difficult journey. And then in verse 7 he says, they go from strength to strength. And that's true. As you're going along, you might start off with just a little bit of strength, but guess what? You overcome one trial. You keep on going, and maybe something even more difficult happens. Maybe something in which you feel completely overwhelmed, and it becomes extremely difficult. But again, God is with you. He's walking alongside of you. He helps you get through it. Maybe not overwhelmingly get through it, but at least step by step, breath by breath, he gets you through that trial, that difficulty. You're making the ascent, and guess what? All of a sudden, you're getting stronger. Your legs are getting stronger. Your heart's getting stronger. Your lungs are getting stronger. In other words, your spiritual perseverance becomes stronger the more and more that you journey. And from strength to strength to strength to strength, from level to level, you become stronger, in which you're able to endure more things for the Lord and accomplish even more for him as you go along. Those who have a heart for the highways of Zion, they go through these hard times, they go through the valley of Baca, they're making the ascent, that sometimes is difficult and arduous, but they're going from strength to strength, and it's the strength that God supplies them as they go along. But then perhaps the most precious part of this whole section in verse 7, each one of them appears before God in Zion. That's an encouragement. What this tells us is that if you have a heart for the highways of Zion, if that's where your heart is, if that's what you are desiring, if that's what you're working for, if you're setting your mind on things above, not the things of the earth, and you're walking through those difficult places with God giving you strength and supplying you with all that you need, but you continue going and you don't give up and you just keep fighting day after day, step by step, inch by inch, all the way up the mount, God makes a promise that you will make it to this heavenly Zion. You will make it to Zion. These people who are going to the physical Zion, who had their hearts were filled with the highways to Zion. Their hearts were the highways to Zion. God was going to be their son, their protector, their shield, their help to make sure they made it to Zion. And the same thing is true with you as well. Please don't ever think that, well, I'm going to go through all this effort and then at the end I'm going to die and God's going to say, no, not good enough. Get out of here. No. If you have a heart for the highways of Zion, God will make sure you make it there. If that's where your heart is, if you're putting that above the things of the earth, you're putting that above your own creaturely comforts and everything, and you have your eyes fixed on the heavenly Jerusalem above, God will see to it that you make it. It might be limping, it might be bleeding, it might be dragging you along, but God's going to make sure you make it there. Don't be afraid to start the journey just because it might be difficult or with fear that you won't make it all the way. It says here, each one of them appears before God in Zion. And each one of us will appear before him in the heavenly Zion if we keep our hearts intent on him, walking by faith, trusting in him, fixing our eyes on him, and have a heart whose highways are to Zion. So that's our encouragement this morning. Psalm 84, what a wonderful, wonderful psalm. The journey is worth it. Why? Because the destination is worth it. The better the destination, the more worth the difficult journey. If you're going to a beautiful place here on this earth, the Bahamas or somewhere that was just beautiful, immaculate, pleasant, it might be difficult getting there. You have to buy a plane ticket, maybe you got to get passports, and you got to go through all this difficulty to get there. But when you got there, you're going to be like sitting back and saying, I'm so glad I went through the trouble. It was definitely worth it. The same thing is true with the heavenly Jerusalem, to heaven itself. It might be difficult now, but boy, when you get there, you're going to look back and say, I am so glad. I'm so glad I didn't stop because it was too difficult, or I didn't even start the journey because it seemed too steep. Stay with the Lord. You will make it. You will be there, and you will be so glad you made the journey. If you would like to start the journey today, we definitely open up the invitation to you now. If you want to come